hello to all of you in person and the thousands and hundreds of thousands that are online. We have work to do. There's a great scripture honored by Jews and Muslims and Christians, and it reads like this in the Message Bible. When Sanballat, Tobiah, Geshem, the Arab, and the rest of our enemies heard that I had rebuilt the wall and that there were no more breaks in it, even though I hadn't yet installed the gates, Sanballat and Geshem sent message, come and meet with us at Capernaum in the valley of Uno in order to stop the work. They were scheming to hurt me. So I sent messengers back with this message. I'm doing a great work, and I can't come down. Why should the work come to a standstill just so I can come down and see you? In person and all around this nation and world, will you say with me, we have work to do? My job today is to lay out the narrative and the call to action. And after all of the powerful witnesses we have heard here today, I have only one thing left to say. It's a message, it's a simple message, and it's been said before. I will try to say and make live one thing as we launch 365 days, Vicki, of organizing towards an in-person mass poor people's low-wage assembly, national moral march on Washington to build power and change the narrative of this nation. And that one thing is we have work to do for a third Reconstruction to end poverty and low wages from the bottom up. That story I just read you was from Nehemiah, and it was a time when the people were hurting. Things were torn apart, injustice was real. And they had had a first construction. They had even had a second reconstruction, but they needed one more. And many of the people laughed at Nehemiah, Liz, and said it wouldn't make a difference. But Nehemiah went out at night, Nehemiah did, and surveyed the condition of the people, and even though he was doing well, he came to the conclusion that it would be better to die reconstructing the nation than to just live and let it be as it was. Nehemiah said, I'm doing a work, and I can't come down. I'm doing a great work. We have work to do. And the determination of Nehemiah the builder is a lesson I've learned from two of my heroes. The first one is Frederick Douglass. After the Dred Scott decision of the Supreme Court, when members of the Supreme Court were actively members of the KKK, and many had been appointed that should not have ever been appointed. And they ruled that black folk had no rights, that white people ever had to listen to, and the Dred Scott decision made it seem like all was lost. Nothing was possible anymore. That an impenetrable wall of injustice had been built by those in power, and decades of consistent efforts had done nothing to reconstruct it. In fact, things had only gotten worse. Don't you ever think that a Trump experience is our first Trump experience. Now, Douglass did not diminish, you don't lie, he did not diminish Anna the evil or the states' rights. He did not diminish what had happened. He actually declared that it was monstrous, that it was deceptive, deadly, and devious. But then after saying very clearly how bad it was, he said there's another side. And there is the side that says we cannot shrink from the work that must be done. And so in the face of increased attacks against humanity, the humanity of enslaved people, Douglass said, listen, the very attempt to blot out forever the hopes of an enslaved people may be one necessary link in the chain of events preparatory to the downfall and complete overthrow of the whole slave system. What if what they have done is their undoing? He said the whole history of the anti-slavery movement is studied with proof that all measures devised and executed with a view to ally and diminish the anti-slavery agitation has only served to increase, intensify, and embolden that agitation. They may have the Supreme Court of the nation, but they don't have the Supreme Court of the universe. And so Frederick Douglass was in essence was saying, we have work to do. But this is also a lesson that I learned from my second hero, my greatest hero, whom I buried 33 years ago today on the summer solstice in 1988, your grandfather, William. And though he had already had a stroke, my father was still working for justice. He died in the morning after he had been out in the community organizing on behalf of poor people in eastern North Carolina. No cameras, not because the newspaper was there, because he believed one day he would have to face the God of the universe. And he taught me that some things are so important that you work your whole life on their behalf. My greatest hero knew that no matter who we are, we have work to do. Especially when so many things are working to the contrary of what we know is right. I want to be like Frederick Douglass and be real honest today, yes. In the state houses of some of the poorest states in the nation, we see racist voter suppression, and the same politicians who support voter suppression use their power once they get elected to deny health care and deny living wages and deny LGBTQ rights. And yes, they mean to take us backwards. Yes, they deny the climate crisis and block the bold action that is needed to transition to renewable energy. Yes, they are serious about supporting unchecked military spending while calling for austerity and tax cuts and defunding of anti-poverty programs. Yes, it seems like they work overtime to build walls of justice rather than pathways to equality. Yes, we know what they are doing, but the question is, what are we going to do? And I declare, with every breath in my body, we have work to do. We are in a time when the UN Special Rapporteur, who acts as the watchdog of extreme poverty around the world, had to issue a withering critique of the state of America today. He said the policies are steering the country toward a dramatic change of direction that is rewarding the rich and punishing the poor by blocking access to even the most meager necessities. Yes, we are living in a time when Joseph Stiglitz said the cost to keep people in poverty is greater than the cost to release people from poverty. And yet we keep paying the wrong cost. And in light of this, the real issue now is not what they have done, but what we will decide to do, and that there is work to be done. Now, we live in a time when we have two glaring political problems that have always existed in this country, and they are represented in the mindset of Mitch McConnell and Joe Manchin. The one political problem we have, Mitch McConnell is a metaphor of meanness, and his obstructionist caucus, they're not just bad politicians, they're just mean as hell. Money has hardened their hearts. They are arrogant and aggressive. They don't intend to establish justice. They lied when they put their hands on the Constitution and swore to uphold it. And they make no secret about it. But on the other hand, we have the problem of manipulations represented by Senator Joe Manchin. And he is a metaphor for those who claim to be moderate. But there ain't no such thing as moderation when it comes to the establishment of justice. The Constitution doesn't say establish justice moderately. The Constitution doesn't say provide for the common defense moderately. The Constitution doesn't say promote the general welfare moderately. The Constitution doesn't say ensure domestic tranquility moderately. The Constitution doesn't say equal protection under the law moderately. Moderate is something we call in Christian language as being lukewarm. And the Lord says everything that's lukewarm, he spews it, vomits it out of his mouth. To claim to be a moderate on constitutional issues like voting rights is a cover for being in the pocket of the wealthy, but you ain't as mean as McConnell to be that honest. And so you hide. You can't compromise with people who don't come believing in the same promise. Compromise means to come with the promise. But if you don't even believe there's a voting problem, you can't compromise with them. If they don't believe there's a poverty problem, you can't compromise with them because they're not working on the same issues that you're working for. And I learned a long time ago in Aesop fables that even if a fox tells you he won't bite you, don't you believe him? The problem we have in our public life also didn't begin with Donald Trump, but it began with the white Southern strategists. And they saw the seats of power were becoming more diverse. And so 50 years ago, they looked at the expansion of our democracy, won by the Second Reconstruction. They saw women and black people and progressive whites and Latinos and indigenous people would increasingly be elected to office. And the people didn't look like them. And so politics was going to change from the good old boys club of gamemanship to a struggle for democracy. You see, in the old system, compromise was the order of the day because there wasn't nobody there but white men. So whichever side you were on, you knew nothing was going to fundamentally change. So you could give a little and take a little in the old boys club. You could slap one another on the backs and then go to night and share drinks that evening because the policies weren't going to hurt you anyway. You were still going to be a millionaire. So here we are. And our democracy itself is in a strange time. It's on a spiral toward death. Compromise is keeping us from addressing issues that cause people to die. The rules of the good old boys club don't apply anymore. When the good old boys are fighting like hell to hold on to the keys to the club and the club itself. Now facing this, Liz, somebody told me to give you and Nelson and Joyce and Alvin and Dr. Forbes a message the other day. They told me to tell y'all to stop offering people hope. They said, why would you have a poor people's campaign and offer people hope? And I said, you don't know what hope is. Hope is not a pipe dream. Hope is when you decide a lie will not work harder than your truth. Hope is when you decide hate will not be stronger than your love. That meanness will not be stronger than your mercy. That injustice will not be stronger than your justice. Jürgen Moltmann once said, faith, wherever it develops into hope, causes not rest but unrest, not patience but impatience. Real hope does not calm the unquiet heart, but itself is an unquieted heart in man. And those who hope in God can no longer put up with reality as it is, and they are willing to suffer underneath it in order to change it. So in times like these, we've got work to do. W.B. Du Bois said a reconstruction, even that T, is not just about changing laws, but it's also about changing the mindset of the people who have lived under injustice. Du Bois taught us that a nation doing the work of reconstruction, the people must realize that they are not just people to be acted upon, but they are people who can act and change things. We can take the Constitution and snatch it away from the obstructionists of the good old boys club. We can lay claims to its claims and promises and make them come alive. Reconstruction begins when we change our mentality and say it's time for you to get your foot off of my neck. And when this happens, we develop a loving militancy in our movement. A loving militancy that says we will not allow anything less than what is promised. And this is not new. Let me show you. In the Declaration of Independence, it says that wherever there has been a long train of abuses, the people must go to work. Let me show you. It says, but when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, inventors are designed to reduce them under absolute despotism. It is their right, it is their duty of the people to throw off such government and provide new guards for their future security. And the truth is, when it comes to poverty and racism and ecological devastation and denial of health care and the war economy and the false distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism, there's been a long train of abuses. Even before the pandemic, there were 140 million Americans poor and low wealth and 250,000 dying a year. There's been a long train of abuses. When corporations use the shock doctrine to scare the nation in a crisis, to give them more money while essential workers are risking everything they can to keep the country alive, while they were the first to go to work and the first to get sick and the first to go to the hospital and the first to die. And those people that are essential workers don't even make a living wage. That's a long train of abuses. As long as the greedy corporate elites and the ruling aristocracy act as though they can chew workers up and spit them out when they get ready, that's a long train of abuse. When the same communities that were enslaved and segregated by Jim Crow are now targeted for predatory lending and over-policing and violent murder by police and environmental racism and mass incarceration, it's been a long train. Same forces that push voter suppression have increased their efforts to abridge the right to vote. And they get applauded by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce when they undermine the United States Constitution. It's been a long train. When the sacred lands of our indigenous Indian siblings, the land that their ancestors died protecting, are being sold off to pipelines and copper mines, it's been a long train of abuses. When this so-called nation of immigrants that stole Texas and California and New Mexico from Mexico then want to treat Mexicans like they aren't Americans too, from South America. And they don't even want to offer asylum seekers. And they want to put up walls and snatch children. It's been a long train of abuses. When we continue to waste billions on the machinery of war, while veterans live on food stamps, it's been a long train of abuses. When we've seen religious nationalism used to prop up greed and prop up and sanctify wrong and perpetrate outright lies, it's been a long train of abuses. When we go through pandemic, Nelson, and the billionaires make $2 trillion more dollars during the pandemic, and 8 million more people fall into poverty. And we got to fight like hell for a living wage and health care and still don't have it. It's been a long train. And the truth of the matter is, only poor and low-wealth people and their moral allies have the legitimate contractor's license to reconstruct America. If I might turn back to my biblical text for a moment, Nehemiah came from among those who had faced injustice. He himself had been in exile, and he had the moral authority then, and therefore, to rebuild society. In the songbook of ancient Israel that is honored by Muslim, Jews, and Christians, the psalmist once declared, the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, and this is the Lord's doing. The truth is, it has always taken the rejected to do the work of rebuilding society. Y'all don't hear me. It took the slaves and their moral allies to bring about the first Reconstruction. It took the stones that had been rejected by Jim Crow, like Rosa Parks and Fannie Lou Hamer and Viola Liusa, to call this nation to the work of a second Reconstruction. It took the miners and people like Mother Jones and Ann Braden to work on this nation and challenge their bosses' greed and being prioritized over people's needs. It took the poor miners to ask the question, which side are you on, my brother? And so now, we have the moral contractor's license to reconstruct the nation. And that's why we're gathered here. That's why we're gathered all over the nation. It's why we're launching 365 days of mobilizing and organizing. It's why we're building power among poor and low-wealth voters. It's past time to go to work. Look at your neighbor and say, neighbor, it's time to go to work. We've got work to do. We've got to cause this nation to recognize that since the United States is the wealthiest nation in the world, indeed, in all of history, it is a moral abomination that there are 140 million poor and low-wealth people in this country. It's time to go to work. We got to make ending poverty a legislative top priority. It's time to go to work. It's time to ensure protection for frontline essential workers and guaranteed income, expansion of unemployment insurance. We've got to guarantee that SNAP and WIC and child tax credits and earned income tax credits and moratoriums on evictions are all made permanent, and that they include undocumented people. It's time to go to work. We've been talking about health care for all since the 1912. It's time to go to work. It's time to update the poverty measurement so we truly measure poverty like it should be. It's time to go to work. It's time to guarantee housing for everybody that's safe. It's time to guarantee the right water and end water and utilities shut-off. It's time for an infrastructure plan and a federal jobs plan that goes into poor and low-income communities and lift from the bottom up. It's time to go to work. It's time not only to protect voting rights, but to expand voting rights. And I wish somebody would shout with me, and no compromise. It's time. It's time to ensure all the rights of indigenous people and tribal nations, including the right to the free expression of their religion and the right to their native land. It's time to embrace a bold agenda to transform the economy away from climate chaos to a green, renewable energy economy that prioritizes the poor and low-income communities. It's time to go to work, y'all. It's time to demilitarize U.S. foreign policy. And it's time to cut the military budget right now 10% and take all of those monies and put them in health care and education and green infrastructure and jobs and anti-poverty programs. And then we need to cut it again. It's time to end unjust mass incarceration and violent policing, and it's time to enact fair taxes on corporations and repeal the 2017 tax cuts and stop letting the rich get away with murder while the poor people die. It's time. And as I prepare to close, if I could borrow from Martin Luther King today, who was a contemporary of my father, anybody who tries to criticize these demands and say that they are somehow un-American or anti-American, let me paraphrase. If our demands are wrong, then the Constitution is wrong. If our demands are wrong, then the promise of equal protection under the law is a lie. If our demands are wrong, then we might as well tear up the Declaration of Independence and the promise for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. If our demands are wrong, then the Bible is wrong when it says, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights. If our demands are wrong, then someone ought to have the courage to say Jesus was wrong when he said all nations will be judged by how they treat the least of thee. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was a stranger, did you invite me in? If our demands are wrong, then the call to be repairs of the breach should have never been placed in the Bible. But the truth is, our call is not wrong. Our call is right. Not only is right, it's the only thing worth spending your lives for. Because if we don't do this work, I fear for this nation. You can't have the levels of injustice that exist now in poverty and racism and think this nation is built on a solid foundation. You can't have the line of pain we're seeing and think you're going to always have rest.